Before I really get rolling, I just want to first share how ecstatic I am to be speaking today. In my career, I have had the lovely opportunity of being able to speak at several conferences and have attended many different events and have even done fun media interviews. And candidly, never have I been so nervous to speak in my whole life. Today in the audience, there are people that I've worked with, people I've done research with, and people that I've mentored under, and you're freaking me out. And I even wore, I'm trying to diffuse everything, I even wore my lucky Swedish fish socks today to try and make me feel a little bit better, and nothing seems to be really rolling yet. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come and find me afterward. I promise I'll be infinitely more eloquent than I present now, as I could probably make diamonds with my butt cheeks. As a quick introduction, my name is Kurtis. I am the director of the AI/ML penetration testing service line at NetSpy. For those who don't know, NetSpy is a security consulting agency that specializes in just about everything that you can imagine, whether it's penetration testing networks to pen testing AI systems. I developed the AI penetration testing service line and am currently the one who still does the majority of the engagements. So I've had a wide exposure to different types of environments, different clients, different hardware, different models, generative and predictive, and even from different testing perspectives, which I feel does grant me a little bit of leniency when it comes to speaking on this topic, as a lot of this I'm incredibly passionate about. And for context, before I came to NetSpy and started dabbling in the security space, I was a machine learning engineer. So I did a lot of model development, and I love math. And that's where my comfort spot is. So speaking to you guys is not. So again, forgive me as we roll along here. But I love the puzzle that is AI security, the intersection between AI, ML, and security, and I think it's critically underdeveloped. There are a lot of companies out there who would really like you to believe that it isn't, and they're, again, candidly, they're very wrong. There are a lot of needs in the industry that we need to address, and a lot of this research that I've done and a lot of the work that I've done has been targeted at helping large companies and small companies recognize how it is that they can effectively secure their systems without uprooting everything from the ground up. How to threat model a given system, how to threat model an AI model particularly, and what the vulnerability scope looks like, how you can execute and find those vulnerabilities, and how you can find the juice, per se. Now, I'm not going to make any of you raise your hands or deal with that. But the purpose of this slide was really just, again, to roll off of what I was just mentioning. I cannot count the number of times I've been in a meeting with a client and the client was, and I do accents again to make me feel more comfortable, so bear with me here, but the client came and said something along the lines of like, I just have this AI model and it is doing me a great amount of good, but I'm not really sure what it's for. And at the end of the day, they had employed this model because it provided them a staple on their web application, right? We've employed AI, and we are cutting edge. And that is a disease that is running rampant through the AI space. It is something that is very difficult to deal with and is in great part a lot of what my job is for, to help people become educated so they can understand not only how it is that they can deploy a model in a safe way, but how they can train a model in a safe way, how they can approach models in a safe way. And candidly, that does not come from just deploying a model and testing it from a black box, as a lot of the vulnerabilities that can be exploited or introduced to a model happen early on in the model's lifespan, even in some points during the conceptual phase, while you're trying to determine what it is you want the model to do. So I've genericized this talk to hopefully cater to a wide group or a wide gradient of people, from those who are maybe exploring the idea of developing models themselves or employing models themselves, to those who are already in the thick of it and are struggling to figure out whether or not they made a mistake, or struggling to figure out whether or not what it is that they have is secure. Now, the testing methodology, as I mentioned, is a very proactive approach, something that ideally would start from the conceptual periods or phases of a model's development. It's no secret that a lot of organizations are very happy or excited to try and employ models that they themselves didn't develop, from places like Hugging Face and other really reputable organizations, whom I love. However, there is risk associated with pulling your data from a third party. There's risk associated with using a model that you yourself didn't train, and there are vulnerabilities associated and risks therein that you should be fully aware of, so not only can you mitigate them, but you can understand what sorts of vulnerabilities an attacker from a black box might be able to exploit. So the testing methodology that I've procured focuses on having a conversation with clients, having a conversation with developers early on to try and help them focus on what it is that they should be worried about. And more often than not, I find that a lot of the developers or machine learning experts who are absolutely phenomenal at building these models and deploying them don't actually know what the vulnerability scope looks like, what exposing or, and I'll put in air quotes, hacking a model looks like, how that happens, how that all comes together. And so before I really dive into the meat of what it is that I wanted to cover today, I'm just going to provide quick definitions for umbrella definitions for what these vulnerabilities look like, and hopefully paint a little bit of a picture going forward so you can see why it is that you'd want to take a proactive approach, why it is you'd want to look at your data long before you're training a model on it, why it is that you'd want to procure your own data if that's possible, or train your own models if that's possible. And so to start, evasion type techniques are when a user is able to perturb a machine learning model in such a way where the output is targeted in a malicious way. An example of this, let's say that I have a image recognition software that is in my smart car. God, I wish I had a smart car. The vulnerability here, or the ability to evade this model, could come in a variety of forms, but a very explicit example, and one that I have done in the wild, involves coercing this software to think that a stop sign is a 55-mile-an-hour sign, and to do so consistently. That's, of course, a very big risk that you probably should be worried about and can be done from a complete black box. Poisoning type vulnerabilities are something that occur generally, and this, also note that the terminology here is evolving, and so next week you may come and say, Kurtis, I have noticed that all these things that you have mentioned to me have changed or they've evolved, and that's because I have literally written tools in 1 week and had them deprecated by the end just because things have been evolving so quickly in this space. So adaptability is important. Quick plug there. But poisoning, as a definition, is a type of attack that occurs during the training process of a given model. It can come in the form of manipulating training data. It can also come in the form of manipulating the code that trains the model or the code that deploys the model. And all of those look very similar, but at the end of the day, perform or behave as what we would call a backdoor. A poisoned backdoor is a bias introduced to a given system or a bit of code introduced to a system that allows an attacker to manipulate the model using a trigger to trigger said backdoor. So again, going back to an image classifier, let's say that your phones have a facial recognition software in them that was developed by somebody else. If that somebody else managed to get a hold of the training data, manipulate it in such a way where they could introduce a backdoor, they could, even though they don't have your face, break into your phone by wearing a particular set of glasses, or by wearing a particular shirt, some form or trigger that they've trained into the model itself. So that is generally what we would consider to be poisoning. Extraction is maybe a little bit different than what I'm sure all your hearts are telling you. Model extraction is not necessarily data extraction verbatim. That is a vulnerability, and we'll get to that down the line. But model extraction is an attacker's ability from a black box to be able to appropriate the target function of a given model, to look at said model, understand the math beneath the hood, and create a subsequent model that will perform, albeit at a reduced overall efficacy, the same function that the original model could do. Now, there are theories and there are research papers out there that suggest that having the capacity to extract a model would allow an attacker to extrapolate or infer context surrounding the training data. Candidly, I have not done this myself, so I can't speak to the validity of that, but the math makes sense. And so I would be concerned on that front as well. And I'm sure within the next months, we will see a lot of evolution when it comes to model extraction. Inference and inversion is probably what you would have thought to be named extraction. This is the hype. This is what everyone is worried about, whether or not the models themselves are implementing or storing your data in a way that can be stolen. Whether the model was trained on your data, can that data be inversed or directly inverted verbatim back to a malicious user? On the other hand, inference is rather than stealing the data verbatim, you begin to steal or infer the context surrounding the training data that would allow you to gain insights on what it is that data is about. Or even, to an extent, start to confidently infer data that was included in that model. Data membership inference is a really good example of this. And then availability attacks being the last one. These are your standard denial of service attacks. Things like slow HTTP attacks and others still work on machine learning models. But the unique attack paths that were introduced with generative models in particular allow a user to manipulate a model in such a way where they can take control of that model's inner monologue is maybe a good way to put it. You can coerce a model into behaving in a particular way, a looped way, that would deny service to that model with a single prompt, and coerce that model to continually do so, so effectively you deny service not only to the original user, but to users around them, without having to just blast requests at a given endpoint or use slow HTTP type attacks. Now, this matters, and note that these are, again, all umbrella approaches, right? And I see people bringing out their phones. You don't need to take a picture. I will have an ebook at the end you can download. The approach here, or the reason that I brought those up, is to help elucidate why it is that taking a proactive approach is important. There are a lot of very simple questions that we want to try and answer early on in the conceptual phases of a model's development, because they can help you not only effectively create a model that you can be confident is secure, but come up with robust methodologies for ensuring that that model will remain secure over time. I will note, however, that the vulnerabilities that I provided before, they're very much umbrellaed. There are so many different subfacets of each of those vulnerabilities that can be branched. They intermix with one another. And so it is very important that we take this approach in addition, because new stuff is evolving all the time. Like I mentioned before, these questions are very simple, but I feel provide a very strong platform for making sure that what it is that you need going forward is secure. The first question is, what is the business use case of the model? And candidly, again, I keep using that word, I feel that this is the question you want to ask yourself first, because this is how the model makes you or your application or your company money. If I build a particular model or implement a model that is designed to do one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that that one thing innately is making my company money. An example of this that I'll start painting, and you'll see how this question is intimately tied to question number 2. Often the answers are the same, but more often they're very different, and it helps you scale the defenses that you're looking to employ to effectively mitigate risk and ensure that the model's efficacy that you're trying to employ is as robust as it can be. So first ask yourself, what is the business use case of the model? How does it make us money? What does that look like? And second, what is the target function or objective of the model, which is the math under the hood? Now, one thing I say a lot to the people who work with me, and you'll probably hear me say multiple times before the end of this talk, is that if math can make it, math can break it. At the end of the day, none of these models are logical, not as we understand them with human logic. They're math, and that's all they are. And so, if you can effectively understand what's going on under the hood, not only can you define a target function, what the math is meant to do, but you can break it. And so asking yourself these 2 questions can really help branch your defensive methodology by helping you focus on what truly matters. I'll maybe paint a little bit of a picture here. Let's say I hopped onto Hugging Face and I downloaded an image classification model. I don't care what kind of model it is, it's just meant to look at images and classify whether or not they're a particular thing. Business 1 downloaded the model and fine-tuned it and put it in their pet shop, a pet application, something that's really cute. You could provide the model an image of your dog, and then it would classify that dog as a particular breed. Nothing innately crazy or insecure about that. On the other hand, another bank takes the same model, fine-tunes it on internal sensitive data, deploys it, and uses it in an ATM. They use it to look at checks and determine whether or not a check is real, or even further, look at the numbers on checks and determine whether or not a $400 check is a $400,000 check. The attack paths and methodologies for these 2 models, and again, this is an idealist scenario, a frictionless world, as physicists would say, where you don't really have to worry about the hardware, but the models themselves and the target function for these 2 models is identical. The math is designed to do the same thing. They are meant to look at images and classify them, and thus the offensive mechanisms that we would employ to break them are effectively identical. However, the business use case for these 2 models is wildly different. One is looking at puppies and the other one is looking at big boy money. And so how do you effectively determine which sort of vulnerabilities you should try and train for? Which sort of vulnerabilities should you prep for? Which vulnerabilities should you try and defend against? There is a defensive mechanism called adversarial training, which a lot of models utilize to try and ensure that their models can recognize these adversarial examples, these perturbations to their models, and respond appropriately. So you can't coerce an ATM into thinking your check is real when it isn't. The sad part about this is we have to dance a very delicate dance when doing so. If you adversarially train a model, you are introducing risk to your system. The more you adversarially train a model, the less likely it is that that model will effectively perform its target function to an adequate degree. And so you have to be very careful. So if we want to come into a given system and just adversarially train everything and say, yes, good, we did it, that isn't an adequate solution. It won't work, and you'll lose a lot of the overall functionality that your model originally provided. So in the two examples that I just provided, one hand, the puppies, who cares if I can convince the model that my Samoyed is a Bernese mountain dog? At the end of the day, it doesn't really pose any security mechanism or any secure vulnerability that would result in the company losing money, nor does it really expose any of the underlying infrastructure of the model itself. But on the other hand, if I can convince an ATM that a check is real, that's a really, really big deal. So understanding the answers to these questions right off the cuff helps you understand whether or not you should look into researching adversarial training, how it is that you should train the model, how much you should train the model, how you can deploy these models down the line to ensure that they're going to be effectively secure to these sorts of vulnerabilities down the line. And that leads me into the next question, and arguably the most difficult. So again, the intersection between machine learning engineering / data science and security is criminally underdeveloped. There are not very many of us, many people are hyped on it, but there are not very many of us actually practicing it as a career. And even more so, there are even less that are producing real juicy papers that can actually be taken from academia and utilized in a real world wild sense. So it's important that we understand that vulnerabilities in this regard don't necessarily standardize themselves in a way we would expect to see more traditional red team vulnerabilities. If you can steal money or expose an underlying infrastructure, that is traditionally a big vulnerability. But rarely have we ever discussed ethics or morality in a given system. That's usually something that is filtered out or resolved long before a program is even written. But in models, explicitly generative models, this is a problem that is running rampant. Where do we draw the line? Who defines those morals? What is ethical, what isn't ethical? And all of those things can be greatly answered and resolved by the data and understanding the data that you're utilizing in your given model. First, the nature of the training data is a bit of a double-edged sword. If I want to build a model and I want to hop onto Hugging Face or Kaggle or any other reputable site and yoink data and then throw it into a training pipeline, I better be very well sure that the training pipeline I have is very efficient at determining whether or not that data has been pre-poisoned by the person who put it there. I didn't procure the data, I didn't create it, and so how is it that I can tell whether or not it's poisoned? That is an innate risk that you shoulder when you use data that you did not procure or harvest or mine. Furthermore, you can look at the data and you can already begin to observe biases. You can start checking, verifying whether or not this data is going to present itself in such a way where you might manifest biases that may not present an innate security risk, but instead pose ethical risks. I believe the first talk shared some very colorful pictures of what a model can do given very innocent prompts, but due to its biases will produce, and those are real problems. And they're security problems and they're data problems. They can be resolved from both ends and should effectively be mitigated from both ends. So it's important that you start target function, business function, and then you dive into where the training data comes from, where the model itself comes from, because these things are all very important and can help inform an attacker or even come directly from an attacker. I can post data to Kaggle and I can upload models onto Hugging Face willy-nilly. And of the, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was some 500,000 models that are on there now. It would not be very difficult for me to just sneak some poisoned ones on there and wait for somebody else to download them and then fine-tune them and then use them in their own environment and then go take advantage of those poison triggers. It is very important that you address these security vulnerabilities from an early stage so you understand the risks that might be associated therein. The next question has greatly to do with what are called transfer attacks or transfer techniques. Now, traditionally in machine learning, when you want a particular model to be transfer trained onto another target function, if the model's innate function is close enough to do so, you can. But that plays to its deficit. If math can make it, math can break it. If you can build an attack that will break a model that is structurally and mathematically similar to another, you can transition that attack from one model to another. So let's say you, average Joe, have implemented a third-party API. It's a GPT 3.5 Turbo, not to name names. And you have elected to provide this model with safe and secure information. Well, that's great for you, but expecting Azure or GPT to keep your data safe is not very wise. Because even if I may not know immediately which form or model of GPT that you're using, I can exfiltrate that fairly quickly. I can then pivot to Hugging Face, find an open source model, get access to the internal gradients and the hyperparameters, build an attack that works on that model, and then just pivot on over to your environment, and I win. So you have to be very careful when it comes to exposing the internal architecture and structure of the models that you're using. You don't want people to know what sort of algorithm you're using. As much as it may hype up your application, it's only going to bite you in the butt. You don't want people to know which version or API you're subscribing to, because those also perform as a leverage point for attackers like myself to take advantage of your infrastructure, to take advantage of your system. And then last, and probably the most important, is after you have the answer to these 4 questions, you need a way to effectively ensure that the processes you underwent to mitigate any risk that you're now aware of are robust. Whether it's using very well-known packages like the Adversarial Robustness Toolbox to try and build adversarial examples yourself, whether it's going to NetSpy or some other consulting agency and getting pen tests, or whether it's testing it internally yourself, you need to verify that the implementations that you have procured are actually secure and didn't just screw over your model if you did adversarial training yourself. And as silly as that sounds, this, again, is probably the most important thing. I have had a conversation just like this with many clients where they have followed the first 4 steps to a T. We're able to threat model their model without fault and had everything all set and perfect, but they didn't test the implementation in post, and nothing worked. And they were mad at me. And that is not necessarily how it works. So make sure that at the end, once you've effectively threat modeled your model, before it's even conceived, you have in place a well understood, on your end or whomever you're paying to do so, structure on how to effectively evaluate the validity of those changes you made. And this brings me to one final thought, is again, like black box testing is incredible and is the majority of the testing that I do. However, with certain vulnerabilities that can be introduced into a given model, such as poisoning, it is almost impossible to detect those from a black box, especially given the size of generative models. It would take you such an incredible amount of computational prowess and time to root these out confidently, you may just be at a loss. So it's important that you try and employ different methods, like data pruning as an example, preemptively to try and ensure that the models that you are deploying are not innately poisoned. Now the juicy part. So everything here that is to follow is not an actual, to save my own booty bum, is not an actual client engagement. However, there are recreates or things that I have actually found in the wild and the methodologies behind how you do them. In one, an image classification model, because those are my favorite, and oh, he's in the back. Will, who is here, Dreadnought, was the one who actually taught me how to do this. So if you have any, subtle questions for him beyond what I can answer, he can definitely give you further context. But I have found this vulnerability in particular on 12 different engagements for large companies. It is a very prevalent issue that can run rampant through your systems if you don't prevent it. Now, really quick before I dive into the code of how it works, to evade a given image classification model, we need to understand how they work. A decision boundary is math, something that is drawn innately, I will use the term drawn, by a model to determine how it is that it classifies a given thing, that thing being X. Now, this is just a representation of a very simple data set, or a model that I trained on the Iris data set, which is like a machine learning engineer classic. It's just identifying whether or not a flower is a particular type of flower based on its petal length. You can see it's very simple, but it's generally not accurate. You're working in a 2D space, and some things can be classified incorrectly, and that's where attackers thrive. So the goal here is to effectively coerce or perturb the model into believing that a particular image you have can be pushed slightly over one of those decision boundaries. So it looks otherwise unperturbed to a human, but is confidently classified as the wrong thing. Now for flowers, that's not really cool. But for a live model that you can go find on Hugging Face today and practice and have fun, the MobileNet V2 model is regularly used in a lot of client environments. It's a very robust, very capable image classification model that is used all over the place. I believe it's an SVM for those who care. How we start this process is by taking an image. So this is my dog, 0, and you provide an image of the dog to the model. The model then effectively classifies her. It classifies household items, and for whatever reason, dog breeds fall in that classification too, as far as the model was concerned. So it correctly and confidently classifies her as a Samoyed. We build a pipeline that allows us to interface with the model, and then we start to use what is called a Carlini L2 attack, or Euclidean distance for the math nerds out there. We generate a mask, which is just a vector, an overlay over the image, and then we begin to perturb that mask pixel by pixel using an optimizer, or we develop an optimizer, define a loss function, and then we begin to perturb pixel by pixel. Now, the image you see on the bottom is what the model would see, but not what we see. So perturbing the mask bit by bit allows us to effectively see where the weights are in the model from a black box. So, and for you big security heads out there, you're probably like, Kurtis, this is an impressive, I could use brute force mechanisms to get here a lot faster. And you're right. But what this allows us to do is it creates a pivot point. It is technically brute forcing, and you can see that without a lot of time, eventually I was able to get her to be misclassified as a Bernese mountain dog? Or a Pyrenean mountain dog. Once you get that, you adjust your form of attack a little bit, and you choose a target. You begin to branch a little bit further, and instead of negating the loss for the original class, we apply the loss directly for any incorrect class. We build another optimizer, and we adjust the vector overlay, the mask, pixel by pixel, until eventually you can get the model to confidently misclassify my simoyed as my favorite thing in the world, a coffee maker. And I would hazard that you'd be hard-pressed to find, well, I mean, no offense to the nice, pretty screen, but that does make it look a lot uglier. You would be very, very hard-pressed to find the differences between the two images. So this is what an evasion type technique would look like, and this is the same approach that I would take if I wanted to break into an ATM. The next, let's see how much time I have. Oh, okay, I gotta hurry. Now, so the next proof of concepts are going to be, I'm going to ramble at you guys, so buckle in. Okay, I'm not a public speaker, and I have no qualms with talking quickly. I believe full-heartedly that the definitions surrounding a lot of these vulnerabilities will change and adapt. If you look at Microsoft's recommendation for determining vulnerabilities in generative AI and compare them with the NIST framework that was just recently released, they're both golden. That's where I suggest you go. Direct prompt injection, or prompt injection in general, is overtly defined as being able to coerce the model into behaving in a way that isn't otherwise proven to be its target function, outside of its candid want for whatever it was proven, whether it's its business function or its math target function. So you combine that idea with direct prompt injection, which is just you directly injecting or prompt injecting into the model itself to get it to behave maliciously, or indirect prompt injection, kind of like the difference between cross-site scripting, stored cross-site scripting, and reflected cross-site scripting. The idea is you either interface directly with the model, or you can get the model to behave maliciously because you've stored some form of information somewhere where the model will access it, whether it's via a RAG mechanism or something else. Now, it's incredibly useful because it allows us to jailbreak a model. Now, this is again where we start to bring in morals. Not only does jailbreaking a model give us access to the innate functionalities that a model may have internal, which can often be calling APIs, having access to information that can be considered sensitive, or we can get it to help us do, well, commit crime is kind of the way that I like to define it. And that is innately immoral. So, right now, the big trendy forms of prompt injection kind of fall within 4 categories. My favorite is the first, adversarial suffix attachment, which can be found if you're interested, because from some research that was done by llmattacks.org. But the idea is basically you coerce the model using its probabilistic behavior into confusing itself during its matrix process to effectively let you create output that is non-ethical, like building a bomb. The BEAST framework is something that I'm really, really excited for. For the machine learning heads out there, it utilizes a beam framework that is a very greedy model that optimizes loss very quickly over time and is proposed to be able to jailbreak a model in less than a minute, given the right computational prowess. The next, these are all great, but I'll get into the juicy stuff. The adversarial suffix example that I have here shows on a live model what it looks like when you break it. You create an adversarial suffix, something that is derived, again, to confuse the model by its formatting and its innate tokenization process into thinking in a loop, and thus allows you or helps you to create a bomb. Please don't, I'm realizing now I didn't black out the unethical parts, so don't learn how to build a bomb, please. The next are compression attacks, which are a GPT-specific vulnerability, and this is done on live GPT right now. Again, I'm not condoning that you go do this, I am just educating you. GPT is extremely smart and is capable of compressing long stories into a succinct little language that it's come up with on its own, using emojis and character shortcuts. And so if you are able to create an effective payload like this that instructs GPT to follow instructions and then ask it to compress those instructions and then return those instructions and ask GPT to interpret them, it will, and subsequently build you a bomb. Or in this instance, help you hotwire a car, which again are innately immoral, and these are things that we need to be concerned about. They are mitigatable and they are preventable, but that comes with a foresight that was unfortunately not really provided in these particular circumstances. And then last, system prompt exposure is something that is also running rampant through the generative AI space. A system prompt is something that a company will provide a model to try and help guide its particular thought processes. Now, I'm pretty sure GPT mitigated this last week, but this was a very simple payload that you could send to it that would get you to, it would spit out the entirety of its system prompt. Now, this is dangerous for two reasons. One, models make a great amount of their decisions and choices based on these system prompts. So if I know exactly verbatim what it is that this model is using to direct its choices, I can create payloads that effectively weave their way around these guardrails. And two, system prompts are greatly considered by especially larger organizations like OpenAPI to be proprietary information. They can include instructions or information about the model itself, which just generic users probably shouldn't be in or have possession of. And so by using a model's want and prompt engineering, or a model's want to follow your instructions and prompt engineering, you can prompt GPT still to, or at least as of last week, to give you its entire system prompt. Now, again, the voices in my head tell me that a lot of people are non-believing that these are things that you can run into in the wild. And so I wanted to share one more war story before I finish and hopefully answer some questions. Last week I was doing an engagement, and outside of just generic prompt engineering, which is a very trendy term that I very much dislike, if ever you want to go make a big stack of money, go work for Anthropic and do prompt engineering for like $350K base. It's gnarly. Like, I think it is a very trendy space that doesn't necessarily use math to break math. Instead, it is just using the English language to manipulate what it is that we're looking at. And that does work, but it won't always work. And so I find it important to share other examples outside of prompt engineering or compression attacks, because you can get a combination of your more traditional vulnerabilities using prompt engineering and having an understanding of the given system. So last week I was doing a test or an engagement on a particular model that wasn't properly isolated. The model itself was sitting, or 2 weeks ago, excuse me, the model itself was sitting in a way where it had access to internal emails. It had not only been fine-tuned and trained on these emails, email addresses, email passwords, and email contents, but it had also been put in an environment where it was capable of calling APIs. It itself didn't call the APIs, but it would format a request and then send it to a particular space. That space would flood it forward, and that was very manipulatable. So after learning that it could call those APIs, using a bit of prompt engineering, we were able to confuse it into returning a verbose error. The first verbose error just included an internal email, which is not as exciting, but as this evolved and we recognized that the model itself was able to call APIs, I was then able to send emails to whomever I wanted. Furthermore, I was able to get passwords from whoever I wanted and harvested almost 4,000 of them. And this is a very real vulnerability that happens, I'm not gonna say regularly and make you think that I'm a god, I'm not, but like the end story here is that models are very much the Wild West, and if they're not properly isolated and properly handled by somebody who well understands what they're capable of, you are going to lose information, or someone is going to leverage that generative model that you love so much to commit crime, and then it's on you. So, if anything, and any of you learn something from me, please learn two things. One, if math can make it, math can break it. And two, if you don't follow these questions, and you don't give your models the appropriate attention that they need before deploying them, I'll get you. And this is the ebook. So if, this is where you want to take pictures. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Sorry I rushed through those last few really, really speedy. If not, again, I am a much more approachable and nice person away from the podium, much less sweaty. So if you just come find me afterward, I would be happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you for your time.